Across the Assunpink Creek, British campfires burned through the darkness. On the Trenton side, Washington's army stood behind a narrow crossing, its guns facing an enemy that had spent the entire day forcing its way south. The British had reached the town at last, but they had not broken the American line. The creek, the bridge, and the high ground on the southern bank had stopped them. That sounded like a victory. It was also a trap. Behind Washington lay the Delaware River. Ice made a rapid evacuation by boat impracticable, and the river left little room to maneuver. If Cornwallis crossed the creek upstream or turned the American right, the Continental Army could be driven toward the water, thrown into confusion, or cut off entirely. Cornwallis halted for the night. His men kindled fires north of the creek, apparently expecting to resume the attack in daylight. Washington had survived January 2nd, but the position could not be held indefinitely. At dawn, the British would have a larger, coordinated assault against an army with the river behind it. The question was no longer whether Washington could defend Trenton for one more night. It was whether he could make the British believe that he was still there after the army had gone. Only a few days earlier, Washington's army had crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory produced prisoners and, more importantly, interrupted the chain of British successes that had driven the Continental Army across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. Washington returned to the western bank with his captives, but he did not stay there. By December 29th through 31st, he was back in New Jersey. The decision carried an obvious danger. British preparations were visible. Forward pickets were active. Intelligence reports pointed toward a counterattack, and many American enlistments expired on January 1st. If Washington withdrew immediately, the first victory at Trenton might evaporate with the Army's retreat. The political and recruiting gains would be surrendered along with the ground. So he called more troops toward Trenton. About 3,600 men under John Cadwalader and Thomas Mifflin marched from the area around Crosswicks and Bordentown to join him on January 1st. The American force that gathered around Trenton is difficult to reduce to a single exact number, because militia came and went. Units were under strength, and soldiers were detached for baggage, prisoners, or rear guard duties. Modern estimates place the effective force somewhere between roughly 4,000 and 5,200 men. Washington knew what was coming. Cornwallis was assembling a much stronger Crown army at Princeton. The American commander had chosen to stand in New Jersey, not because the danger was hidden, but because retreat would throw away the reason the army had crossed the river in the first place. Trenton had created an opening. Now Washington had to hold it long enough to use it. Cornwallis had been preparing to leave for Britain when news of the Trenton defeat recalled him to the field. At Princeton, he gathered British and German units from the New Jersey cantonments and began moving south on January 2nd. Estimates of the force advancing toward Trenton range from about 6,000 to 8,000, substantially more than Washington could place behind the Assunpink. The direct route was the post road from Princeton through Maidenhead, now Lawrenceville, toward Trenton. Washington did not wait for that column to arrive intact. He sent Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen, the German regiment, and Virginia troops onto the road ahead of the main position. Their task was not to defeat Cornwallis in open battle. It was to make every stage of the advance cost time. The Americans occupied one position, fired, and retired. The British deployed to answer them, reorganized their formations, and moved forward again. Resistance appeared near Maidenhead and later on wooded, rising ground closer to Trenton. Each delay stretched the Crown column farther along the road. Washington reported that the head of the British force did not reach Trenton until about 4 p.m., while its rear was still near Maidenhead, roughly 6 miles away. The ground itself joined the American defense. New Year's weather had brought rain and an unusual thaw. The roads were deeply muddy, smaller streams were swollen, and the long column could not move as a single body. A British participant complained that units failed to march together and that substantial time disappeared while formations joined the advance. Cornwallis still possessed the strength to attack. What he was losing was the daylight needed to use it. Washington's main position rested on the elevated southern bank of the Assunpink Creek. The American line extended from near the Delaware eastward along the creek and the mill pond, with the right reaching wooded ground. The entire defensive sector may have stretched for miles, but the decisive ground lay near the bridge and the crossings below it. Henry Knox estimated that between 30 and 40 American artillery pieces stood ready in front of the army. The forward troops fell back through Trenton as the British and Hessian units pushed after them. They did not retreat as an unprotected crowd. American cannon covered the withdrawal across the bridge. Once the last men cleared the crossing, the pursuing troops came within range of the massed guns on the higher bank. The bridge offered Cornwallis a narrow target and a dangerous approach. British troops had to descend toward lower ground, compress their formations, and advance into musket and artillery fire from above. Riflemen, field pieces, and infantry also watched the fords and other possible crossings. The principal bridge was a confined stone structure, and an attacking column could not spread freely as it approached. The British tried repeatedly to force the passage. Several accounts describe at least 3 efforts against the bridge, together with attempts to use fords or work around the American flank. At roughly 60 yards from the crossing, the attackers entered an especially destructive zone. American fire drove them back each time. The cannonade continued until darkness, and after nightfall, American shells occasionally fell into Trenton, keeping the Crown troops from settling comfortably in the town. The bridge had stopped the attack. It had not solved Washington's larger problem. Every American soldier who remained at Assunpink was still between Cornwallis and the Delaware. The defense of Assunpink bought Washington a night. It did not give him a position he could safely hold until morning. The creek protected the front, but it also fixed the shape of the battle. Cornwallis could renew the attack at daylight, send troops upstream, or turn the American right while the river blocked an easy retreat to the west. Knox called the position strong but hazardous. Washington reached the same conclusion from the movement of the British Army. The enemy was substantially superior in number, and the intention appeared to be surrounding the Americans rather than merely pushing them away from Trenton. If the British crossed the creek beyond the bridge, Washington's line could be turned. If the right collapsed, the rest of the army might be driven toward the Delaware with no practical route across it. Cornwallis had also been marching and fighting through mud for much of the day. His column remained extended, and darkness made another assault against the defended creek increasingly dangerous. He stopped opposite the American line and lit fires. Later stories give him a colorful promise about capturing Washington in the morning, but the secure fact is simpler. The Crown Army remained in front of the creek and expected to resume operations after daylight. That pause created the opening Washington needed. Cornwallis had concentrated his attention on the bridge, the fords, and the American front. Beyond Washington's right, roads led away through country that was not being adequately watched. A defensive victory had forced the British to stop. Now Washington had to turn that pause into movement before the trap closed again. During the fighting, Arthur St. Clair had examined the far right sector of the American position and noticed that the roads beyond it appeared free of British patrols. Joseph Reed and local patrols were associated with knowledge of the country, and officers confirmed that the route could pass around Cornwallis's eastern flank. The precise division of credit for the idea was later disputed. Washington's reports do not assign it to one subordinate. What is clear is that Washington approved the operation and commanded it. The alternatives were grim. He could wait for the expected morning assault, he could retreat south toward the roads the British would naturally watch, or he could evacuate the creek line, move around the unguarded side of Cornwallis's army, and strike Princeton, a British post roughly 9 to 12 miles behind the main force. This was not a conventional retreat. It was a withdrawal designed to become an attack. If the army reached Princeton before Cornwallis understood what had happened, Washington could hit the divided Crown position and open a route toward the Watchung Highlands. If the movement was discovered on the road, the Continental Column would be strung out in darkness, with artillery, wagons, infantry, and rear guards unable to deploy quickly. The decision therefore demanded more than courage. It required concealment, reliable roads, a frozen surface for the guns, and a British failure to watch the one corridor that mattered. Washington's army had to disappear from the creek while leaving Cornwallis convinced that nothing had changed. The route around Cornwallis was longer than the direct road and far worse for an army. South of Quaker Bridge, it crossed narrow neighborhood tracks rather than a proper military highway. The ways were rough, irregular, deeply rutted, and obstructed by stumps. Woods, marshy sections, icy streams, and darkness would slow a column already worn down by fighting. Only hours earlier, the thaw had made movement miserable. The same mud that delayed Cornwallis threatened to trap Washington's artillery and wagons. A gun stuck on the road would not merely slow the army, it could expose the entire plan to daylight and pursuit. The weather changed with the decision. A sharp drop in temperature brought a northwesterly wind, and by about 2 a.m., Captain Thomas Rodney recorded that the ground had frozen firm. The roads that had been nearly bottomless became hard, rough tracks. That did not make the march easy. It made it possible. The transformation had an almost cruel symmetry. Cornwallis had been slowed by rain, thawing ground, swollen streams, and the need to coordinate a long column. Washington now received a surface firm enough to carry men, guns, and wagons before the sun rose. The operation still depended on silence and direction, but the wheels would no longer disappear into mud. A few degrees of weather had changed the military problem. The escape route remained narrow and difficult, yet it could now carry the force toward Princeton instead of holding it at the Assunpink. Soon after dark, Washington began the deception by moving the baggage away from the army. The train went south toward Bordentown and Burlington, while the fighting column prepared to move in the opposite direction. The separate movement reduced congestion on the escape route and suggested that the Americans were making an ordinary withdrawal toward the Delaware crossings. The camp itself had to continue looking occupied. Fires were renewed. Guards remained at the bridge and at other passes upstream. Small parties stayed behind long enough to preserve the impression that Washington's army was still preparing defenses along the creek. Accounts commonly describe noise from picks, shovels, or entrenching tools striking the ground, although the exact form of that noise cannot be fixed with certainty. From across the Assunpink, British observers could see the fires and hear activity. Those signs supported the most natural expectation. The Americans would remain behind their works and fight again in the morning. The visual evidence was false, but it was not random. Every remaining guard, fire, and sound had to suggest continuity. The deception also had a physical purpose. A large baggage train would clog the roads and make noise. By sending it away first, Washington created a lighter combat column. Later military histories describe cloth placed around cannon and wagon wheels to muffle their movement over the frozen ground. The official report does not mention that detail, but it fits the larger effort to suppress every sound that might carry across the winter night. The army was not leaving a silent camp. It was leaving a camp that seemed to stay. The evacuation unfolded in phases around midnight and through the early hours of January 3rd. Washington gave midnight as the departure time. Knox placed the beginning of the march at about 1 a.m., and Rodney recorded secret orders around 2. These times can describe different parts of the movement: baggage, leading troops, artillery, the main body, or the final guard. Orders passed quietly. Many soldiers did not know the destination. Some believed they were moving against Cornwallis's rear. Others guessed Princeton. That uncertainty was deliberate. The fewer men who knew the whole plan, the less chance that a captured sentry, straggler, or deserter could reveal it. The column filed away from the Assunpink, leaving the guards and camp activity behind. It did not take the direct post road back toward Princeton. Washington moved south and east, crossed the creek farther upstream near Quaker Bridge, and then turned north along secondary roads. The complete route was about 16 miles, considerably longer than the direct distance. On those tracks, an army could not move like a compact parade. The road narrowed, wheels struck frozen ruts, and the different parts of the column had to maintain contact without losing speed. Guns and wagons were especially vulnerable to delay. A British patrol at the wrong point could have found the Americans stretched between crossings, woods, and farm roads with no room to form a battle line. No such patrol blocked the corridor. The army continued north through the darkness, carrying its artillery toward Princeton, while Cornwallis watched the fires at Assunpink. At daybreak, British observers reported that the American army had vanished. The fires were still burning, and the guards had remained long enough to make the camp appear occupied. The baggage movement strengthened the first explanation. Washington seemed to have retreated south toward Bordentown. That interpretation bought the Americans the minutes they needed. Cornwallis had not sealed the roads northeast of the Assunpink, and no British picket blocked the Quaker Bridge route when the American column passed. The Crown Army had spent the night opposite the position it believed Washington still held. By the time the truth emerged, Washington's leading formations were already moving toward Princeton. The deception did not make the army invisible. It delayed recognition. That distinction mattered because the American force had to reach the British rear post before Cornwallis could turn the main body back from Trenton. A discovery on the road, while the column was still divided among narrow tracks, could have transformed the escape into a disaster. Instead, the sounds of the camp faded behind the Americans. The rear guard withdrew after the main body had cleared the position, and the British discovered an empty line where they had expected another battle. Cornwallis now had to reverse the problem he had created for Washington. The army he had intended to attack at dawn was no longer in front of him. It was somewhere behind his own position, approaching Princeton. Washington's column reached the Princeton area around dawn or sunrise. The escape had happened in darkness. The main fighting began after visibility improved in the early morning. The clear winter air exposed movement across open fields, while woods, orchards, hedges, and low ridges hid formations until they crossed from one compartment of the countryside into another. At Princeton, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood was already moving. He had the 17th Regiment, part of the 55th Light Dragoons and Artillery, and was heading south to join Cornwallis. The 40th remained near Princeton, along with much of the 55th. The British post was therefore divided, and the units on the road were not waiting in a stationary garrison for Washington to arrive. Near Worth's Mill, Mawhood or his scouts saw American movement across open ground. The exact sighting cannot be reconstructed with certainty. One likely possibility is that he observed part of John Sullivan's larger column crossing cleared land and turned to intercept what he thought might be troops escaping from Trenton. Instead, his force encountered Hugh Mercer's advanced detachment near the farms of William and Thomas Clark. The meeting was sudden because both sides were moving toward different objectives. Washington had hoped to strike Princeton before the British could react. Mawhood was attempting to reach Cornwallis. In the open spaces around the Clark houses, those two movements collided. The road behind Cornwallis had delivered the Americans to Princeton, but it had not delivered them to an empty battlefield. Mercer's detachment moved through wooded and cleared farmland toward an orchard near William Clark's house. The orchard was enclosed by a substantial hedge, while wheat fields, fences, drainage ditches, farm buildings, and low slopes divided the ground into small compartments. The terrain gave neither army a clean, uninterrupted view of the whole action. When the British were recognized, Mercer's men entered the orchard and the two forces exchanged close volleys. Accounts differ over which side fired first, but the opening was brief and violent. The regulars then fixed bayonets and charged. Many American riflemen and militia lacked bayonets or were not equally prepared for a fight at arm's length. Captain Daniel Neal's two guns stood outside the orchard on the American left. His New Jersey artillerymen fired canister into the British right. British return fire killed Neal, and the bayonet attack overran the pieces. Additional American artillery was delayed by the difficult approach and the crossings, leaving Mercer's detachment exposed at the moment the British charge gathered speed. The American line broke and fell back. Mercer's horse was shot, separating him from much of his command. British soldiers reportedly demanded the surrender of the prominent officer, possibly mistaking him for Washington. Mercer resisted with his sword and received wounds that would prove mortal. The exact number and circumstances of those wounds are uncertain, but he was carried to Thomas Clark's house and died on January 12th. In minutes, Mawhood had turned a moving encounter into a close-range assault. The American advance guard had lost its guns, its formation, and one of its senior commanders. Cadwallader's Philadelphia militia came forward as Mercer's men retreated. Instead of finding a stable line to join, the militia met fugitives, confusion, and British fire. Cadwallader tried to deploy while exposed to musketry and artillery, but the arriving companies mixed with the men falling back from the orchard. The formation became disordered. It recoiled and abandoned another gun. For a few moments, Mawhood's smaller force had defeated two American bodies in succession. Mercer's detachment first, then Cadwallader's arriving militia. The British had already captured the momentum of the encounter and were pressing into the approach to Princeton. This was the most dangerous instant of the entire operation. Washington had marched around Cornwallis, crossed difficult roads in darkness, and reached the British rear post. Yet the first contact threatened to destroy the column before the main body could deploy. A night march that had succeeded operationally could still end in a daylight collapse. The soldiers retreating from the orchard carried the shock of the bayonet charge into the next formation. British regulars, still advancing after their first success, appeared to have opened the road to Princeton. The American line had not yet found a position from which to use its numerical weight or artillery. Behind the fugitives, however, unbroken Continental formations were coming forward. Washington and Nathanael Greene were close enough to see the crisis. The battle was about to shift from isolated detachments to the mass of the army that had survived the Assunpink and the night march. Near Thomas Clark's house, fresh American troops formed on a low ridge. Artillery associated with Thomas Mulder took position near the house, while Continental infantry arranged itself in a three-rank line. Washington, Nathaniel Greene, and other officers worked among the men who had fallen back, trying to steady them while new formations moved into the fight. Washington then advanced conspicuously near the front as the reorganized line faced Mawhood's troops. The exact distance and every movement in the later accounts cannot be fixed, but his exposed presence at the decisive moment is well supported. Soldiers who had just watched Mercer's line and Cadwallader's militia recoil saw their commander riding forward with the troops that were about to answer the British charge. The balance changed quickly. Fresh infantry came onto the field. American artillery resumed firing. Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen pressed against the British flank, while troops associated with Isaac Hitchcock, St. Clair, Cadwallader, and Mifflin extended the American front. Mawhood's men had won ground, but their charge and pursuit had disordered them, and they could no longer face pressure from both sides. The British line broke. They abandoned artillery and packs as they withdrew from the field. Mounted dragoons crossed the intact bridge at Worth's Mill and rode toward Maidenhead, while other troops escaped toward Trenton, Rocky Hill, and New Brunswick. American soldiers pursued for several miles and captured stragglers. The central combat was extraordinarily short, though descriptions of the wider episode vary. The decisive sequence, from Mawhood's encounter with Mercer to the collapse of the reinforced British line, may have taken about 15 minutes. In that brief interval, the army that had been retreating became the force driving the British away from Princeton. The defeated British elements did not escape as one coherent body. Some fled toward Trenton, others toward Rocky Hill and New Brunswick, while the remaining defenders withdrew into Princeton. The 40th Regiment and the unengaged portion of the 55th gathered near the town, but they could not hold the position once American formations approached from the south. Most of the British troops retreated north. A smaller group took refuge inside Nassau Hall, the principal building of the College of New Jersey. The building was not an invisible shelter. American artillery fired against it, and a demand for surrender followed. The men inside capitulated. Artillery fire against Nassau Hall is well supported. A famous later tradition assigns the crucial shot to Alexander Hamilton's New York artillery and says that a ball passed through the chapel and knocked a portrait of King George II from its frame. The bombardment is credible. The exact gun crew, projectile path, and effect on the portrait remain uncertain. Once the building changed hands, American prisoners held there were released. Weapons, blankets, military stores, and cannon were seized before Cornwallis could return from Trenton. The town's defenders had not been destroyed in one formal assault. They had been caught between the advancing American army and the need to escape before the much larger Crown force came back. Washington had reached Princeton, defeated the force that met him on the road, and compelled the remaining garrison either to flee or surrender. The next danger was already moving north from Trenton. New Brunswick lay ahead, and it offered a far greater prize. The British held important baggage, magazines, money, and supplies there. After the victory at Princeton, Washington initially considered forcing the army onward for roughly 17 additional miles to strike that base before Cornwallis could intervene. The men, however, had already fought on January 2nd, marched through the night, and fought again in the morning. They had done so with inadequate rest, food, or drink. The army now carried prisoners and had to care for wounded men. Its formations had to move with the same exhausted soldiers who had just pursued the defeated British from the Clark farms. Cornwallis was racing back from Trenton. A further march toward New Brunswick would lengthen the American column and give the British a chance to catch it before it reached defensible ground. The stores were tempting, but the army itself was the larger asset. Washington abandoned the attempt. The decision left British supplies at New Brunswick, yet it prevented the Princeton victory from turning into a pursuit beyond the strength of the men who had won it. The army would leave the town with prisoners, captured material, and its own wounded, moving toward ground where Cornwallis could no longer force an immediate decisive battle. The retreat from Princeton was not an uncontrolled flight. Washington used the crossings behind him as obstacles. A detachment damaged or dismantled the bridge at Worth's Mill over Stony Brook. Farther north, the bridge over the Millstone at Kingston was also taken up or disabled. Cornwallis's advance elements eventually came within sight of the retreating Americans across the Millstone, but the damaged crossing imposed another delay. The British had followed quickly from Trenton, yet the bridges and rivers kept the pursuit from becoming a direct blow against the exhausted American column. Washington continued through Pluckemin while the army moved toward the Watchung Highlands. The terrain changed the problem again. Morristown and the surrounding mountains offered defensible high ground, access to local resources, and routes from which American forces could threaten British communications in northern New Jersey. The army that had stood exposed between the Delaware and Cornwallis was moving into a position where the British could not easily force it to fight on open terms. Cornwallis also had to protect his own base. The defeats at Trenton and Princeton caused the Crown Army to contract its exposed inland positions. British forces concentrated principally around New Brunswick and Perth Amboy, closer to strong bases and naval support. American regulars, militia, and local forces increasingly harassed British foraging parties and communications. The bridges slowed the pursuit. The mountains received the army. The British had begun the campaign by spreading across New Jersey. Now they were pulling inward. The army that had seemed trapped between Cornwallis and the Delaware had crossed into ground where a decisive British blow was no longer easy. Behind it remained the Assunpink fires, the abandoned British packs near Princeton, and the disabled bridges along the pursuit route. Washington's soldiers were exhausted, carrying prisoners and wounded men after 2 days of fighting and a night march. They continued toward the hills while Cornwallis turned back to protect the main base and supplies. The escape had begun beside a creek with the river behind it. It ended with the British forced away from the interior roads of New Jersey.